Alright, let's go. Number 10. The Waldseemüller Prophecy. In 1507, a German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller printed a map on 12 large woodcut sheets, and on one of those sheets he wrote a single word that would define an entire hemisphere for the next 500 years. America. It was the first time the name had ever appeared on a map. Waldseemüller placed it across the landmass of the New World, a continent his contemporaries barely understood, a place still smoldering at the edge of European awareness, where explorers had touched only fragments of coastline and returned with more questions than answers. He named it, and in naming it, he claimed to know its shape. That claim should have been absurd. In 1507, no European had crossed the New World, no one had walked its interior, no one had stood on its far shore and looked west. The landmass was, to the men who financed the ships, a coastline and nothing more. A margin. A rumor with beaches. Whatever lay behind those beaches was blank, unmapped, unknowable. The explorers themselves did not yet understand what they had found. Many still believed they had reached the outer islands of Asia, that Cathay and the spice ports lay just beyond the next headland. Waldseemüller disagreed. On his map, he drew the New World not as a fringe of Asia, not as a scattering of islands, but as a separate continent, a distinct body of land, standing alone, severed from the Old World by open ocean on both sides. This was a radical assertion. It contradicted the geographic consensus of the age. It contradicted Columbus himself, who died believing he had sailed to the edge of the East. Waldseemüller looked at the same fragmentary reports and drew a different conclusion. He drew America as its own thing. But here's where the map becomes genuinely impossible. On the western edge of his newly named continent, Waldseemüller drew a coastline, a shore facing an ocean. He depicted the New World as bounded on its far side by open water, the body we now call the Pacific, and he did this years before any European reached that ocean. Vasco Núñez de Balboa would not stand on the Pacific shore of the Americas until 1513. Magellan's survivors would not cross that ocean until the 1520s. Yet in 1507, on a sheet of woodcut paper in a small town in the mountains of eastern France, the western coastline of the Americas was already drawn. The water was already there. The continent already ended where, decades later, exploration would confirm that it ended. He had no way of knowing this. There was no source, no survey, no fleet had reported back from a shore that no European had yet seen. The information did not exist in any form Waldseemüller could have consulted. And yet the shape he committed to paper matched the world. Scholars have argued for a century over how this happened. Some call it an inspired guess, a cartographer's intuition stretched across a void of data. Some point to lost source charts, older maps compiled from voyages whose records have not survived. The truth is that we do not know where the western coastline came from. We know only that Waldseemüller drew it, that it was correct, and that the men who would eventually confirm it were still years from being born as sailors, still landlocked in the certainty that Asia lay just past the horizon. The map named a world before that world was known. It drew an ocean before that ocean was crossed, and it did both from a place that should have been utterly blind to either. The instinct to draw a coastline you have never seen, to commit a nation's future to a shape you cannot verify, was not unique to Waldseemüller. Elsewhere in Europe, another map was being drawn that would guide real ships toward a real shore, and men would kill to keep it secret. Number 9. The Smuggled Planisphere. In 1502, in a workshop somewhere in Lisbon, a cartographer completed a map that Portugal considered a state secret worth killing for. It was hand-painted on parchment, glowing with gold leaf, deep greens, and red banners that marked the flags of competing crowns. It charted the coastline of Brazil, the shores of Africa, and a single vertical line slicing down through the Atlantic. That line was the most dangerous piece of information in Europe. The map is called the Cantino planisphere, named not for the man who drew it, but for the man who stole it. Portugal had spent decades building an empire of knowledge from the voyages of its navigators. Every coastline mapped, every current recorded, every reef and harbor noted was classified intelligence. To possess Portugal's charts was to possess the sea routes to wealth, and in 1502, an agent working for the Duke of Ferrara acquired one and smuggled it out of the country to Italy. The scale of what was on that parchment is what makes the theft comprehensible. The map showed the newly discovered coast of Brazil, sketched from voyages that had touched South America only 2 years earlier. It showed the western coast of Africa, with the accuracy of men who had sailed it repeatedly, and it showed the line of Tordesillas, the invisible boundary that divided the entire planet between Spain and Portugal. That line was not a geographic feature, it was a legal one. In 1494, the two Iberian powers had signed a treaty dividing the unexplored world between them, drawing a meridian through the Atlantic, and declaring that everything to the east belonged to Portugal, and everything to the west belonged to Spain. Whole continents were partitioned by nations that had not yet seen them. The Cantino map rendered that abstraction visible, placing Brazil on the Portuguese side of the line and quietly asserting a claim to a landmass Europe barely knew existed. But here's where the map stops being a curiosity and becomes something genuinely unsettling. The Brazilian coastline, drawn on that parchment in 1502, was not a rough guess. It was accurate. Accurate enough that navigators used it to find their way back to shores they had visited only once. Accurate enough to anchor colonial claims that would reshape a continent. The men who drew that coast had sailed it, measured it, and encoded it into pigment with a precision that would guide real ships across real ocean for years afterward. Consider what that means. A single sheet of gazelle-thin parchment, small enough to roll and hide beneath a cloak, contained enough geographic truth to direct the colonization of South America. The coast of Brazil painted in Lisbon matched the coast of Brazil that ships would find. Not approximately, not in outline, in navigable detail. This was not decoration. It was a working instrument disguised as art. The implications ripple outward. Portugal understood that its maps were more valuable than gold, more dangerous than armies, because a map that matched the world could be followed by anyone who held it. The theft of the Cantino planisphere was not the theft of an object. It was the theft of the ocean itself, or at least the knowledge of how to cross it and where to land. The Duke of Ferrara did not want a painting. He wanted the truth Portugal had bled to acquire, and the map survived. It hangs today in a library in Modena, Italy, its gold leaf still catching the light, its Brazilian coastline still tracing the shape of a shore that ships once used it to find. The banners still fly their painted colors. The line of Tordesillas still divides a world that no longer recognizes it. A stolen secret, hundreds of years old, still holding the exact shape of the coast it was drawn to describe. Number 8. The Babylonian map of the world. Sometime around the 6th century BCE, an unknown scribe in Mesopotamia pressed a stylus into wet clay and drew the oldest surviving attempt to render the entire world on a single surface. It is called the Imago Mundi, and it fits in the palm of your hand. The tablet is small, roughly 12 by 8 centimeters, a slab of cracked reddish-brown clay covered in the dense wedge strokes of cuneiform script. It looks like nothing. A broken cookie of baked earth, chipped at the edges, unremarkable among the thousands of clay fragments recovered from the ruins of Mesopotamian cities. You could walk past it in a museum case without a second glance. But etched into that unremarkable surface is a diagram that reveals how an ancient people understood the shape of everything they knew. At the center sits Babylon. The city is drawn straddling the Euphrates, the river represented as a pair of parallel lines running down through the heart of the map. Around Babylon cluster other cities and regions, marked with small circles and labels, the known territories of the Mesopotamian world arranged around the imperial center. And encircling all of it, wrapping the entire landmass in a single continuous ring, runs a band of water, the scribe called the Bitter River, the ocean, a circular boundary marking the edge of the world. The numbers here are not measured in kilometers or discharge rates. The scale is conceptual. This is a map of a worldview, compressed onto a surface the size of a postcard, and every element on it is a statement about how the Babylonians located themselves in the cosmos. Babylon is not just a city on this map. Babylon is the center of creation, the fixed point around which all other places orbit. But here is where the standard reading of the Imago Mundi as pure mythology begins to break down. For a long time, scholars treated this tablet as cosmology, dressed up as geography, a religious diagram with no relationship to the actual land, a symbol, not a survey. The circular ocean, the perfectly centered capital, the triangular regions radiating outward into legend, all of it seemed to belong to the realm of belief rather than measurement. Then researchers looked more closely at what the map actually recorded. The Euphrates on the tablet does not wander randomly. It runs where the Euphrates ran. The relative positions of the cities and marshes and mountains around Babylon correspond, in their broad arrangement, to the real geography of Mesopotamia. The scribe who drew this was not inventing a fantasy landscape. He was encoding genuine geographic knowledge, the accumulated understanding of the rivers, wetlands, and settlements that defined the world between the Tigris and the Euphrates, into a diagram that also carried cosmological meaning. The Imago Mundi confirms that the Babylonians possessed a real and accurate mental model of their river systems. They knew where the water ran, they knew how their cities related to it, they knew the Euphrates was the artery that fed their civilization, and they placed it at the literal center of their picture of the world, because, for them, it was. What makes this tablet particularly haunting is the fusion it represents. There was no separation, in the mind of that ancient scribe, between the sacred and the surveyed. The map is simultaneously a religious statement and a topographic record. The Bitter River is both a real ocean at the edge of known lands and a mythological boundary between the human and the divine. The Babylonians did not draw two kinds of maps. They drew one, and it held everything at once. The tablet still sits in a museum collection today, cracked and reddish-brown, its cuneiform faint but legible, the oldest known picture of the world quietly asserting that the people who made it knew exactly where their rivers ran. That same marriage of grid and geography, of measurement pressed into permanent stone, would appear again half a world away. Number 7. The Tracks of Yu. In 1136 CE, Chinese artisans took a slab of dark stone and incised into its surface a map so precise that modern cartographers would not match its accuracy for another 6 centuries. The Yu-Ji-Tu, the map of the Tracks of Yu, was carved with a grid system laid across its entire face, fine white lines cut into the stone, each square representing a fixed unit of distance. Every line converted geography into measurement. Every square anchored a river, a coastline, a bend in a valley to a coordinate that could be counted, checked, and reproduced. The map depicts China's river systems in extraordinary detail, tracing the great arteries of the country across its stone surface. The Yellow River, the Yangtze, the vast drainage networks that fed the world's oldest continuous civilization, rendered not as decorative flourishes, but as measured pathways across a mathematical grid. The scale of the achievement is staggering. This was not a sketch, it was a survey. The numbers reveal what the carvers understood. The grid divides the map into hundreds of squares, each one representing roughly 100 li, a fixed Chinese unit of distance. This means every feature on the map exists in proportional relationship to every other feature. The distance between 2 points on the stone corresponds to the distance between those same 2 points on the ground. A river that bends a certain way in the carving bends that same way across thousands of kilometers of actual Chinese landscape. The carvers had built a scale model of an empire. But here's where the Yu-Ji-Tu becomes genuinely disturbing to modern assumptions about cartographic history. When surveyors compared the map's rendering of China's rivers and coastlines to satellite data and modern hydrological surveys, the courses matched. Not approximately, not in general outline. The path of the Yellow River, the winding of the Yangtze, the shape of the coastline, where the land meets the sea, all of it aligns with startling precision to what modern instruments record. A slab of stone carved nearly 9 centuries ago, before European cartography had any comparable grid system, before the tools that would later make such accuracy routine, depicts China's waters almost exactly as they exist today. The implications are profound. The mapmakers who created the Yu-Ji-Tu were working centuries ahead of the cartographic technique available anywhere else on Earth. European maps of the same era placed Jerusalem at the center of the world, distorted continents to fit theological schemes, and populated the margins with sea monsters. Meanwhile, in China, someone had already solved the fundamental problem of cartography: how to translate the curved, sprawling, immeasurable surface of a landscape into a flat, gridded, measurable image without sacrificing accuracy. The grid on the Yu-Ji-Tu is the same conceptual tool that modern maps use. The Chinese carvers arrived at it independently, and they arrived at it early. How did they gather the data? To render river courses this accurately across the entire expanse of China would have required systematic surveying on a scale that implies enormous coordinated effort, generations of accumulated observation, and a sophisticated understanding of distance and proportion. The mapmakers who compiled this knowledge left no signature. Their methods, their instruments, their organizing institutions are largely lost to us. What survives is the stone itself and the proof it carries. That stone still exists. It rests today as a physical artifact, its white grid lines still visible against the dark surface, its rivers still tracing the same courses they traced when the carving was fresh. The waters of China have shifted, flooded, and cut new channels in the centuries since, yet the map remains a startlingly faithful record of a landscape it captured, with tools we still do not fully understand. It sits there, incised in stone, a 900-year-old survey that modern instruments could only confirm, waiting for anyone willing to measure it against the world it silently, precisely describes. Number 6. The Bedolina petroglyph. High in the Italian Alps, in a valley called Val Camonica, someone knelt on a slab of gray stone during the Bronze Age and began to carve, not words, not symbols of gods or animals or the hunt, a map. Using a harder stone as a chisel, they pecked thousands of tiny points into the rock surface, gradually building an image that would confound scholars for centuries after the hand that made it had turned to dust. The carving shows fields, paths, dwellings, rectangular plots connected by winding lines, clusters of small structures, the geometry of a landscape organized by human intention. It is considered one of the oldest known topographic representations on Earth, a document of place created by people who had no written language, no mathematics as we understand it, no instruments of any kind. Just observation, memory, and a stone edge worked patiently against stone. The scale is difficult to grasp. This carving predates the Roman roads by more than 1,000 years. It predates Ptolemy's coordinates. It predates the alphabet reaching most of Europe. The people who made it left no inscriptions, no burial texts, no explanation of what they were doing or why. They left only the rock and the pattern pecked into it. But here's where the Bedolina petroglyph becomes genuinely unsettling. When scholars studied the layout of the carving and compared it to the valley itself, the fields, the paths, the arrangement of plots, they found a correspondence. The rectangular shapes and connecting lines appear to match the actual field patterns of the valley below, not a decorative abstraction, not a symbolic representation of an imagined place, a record of the real terrain, drawn by someone who understood how that terrain was divided and worked. The implications are staggering. To map a valley's fields from above requires a mental capacity that should not, by conventional assumptions, exist in a Bronze Age alpine community. It requires the ability to take a landscape experienced only from ground level, walked step by step, plot by plot, and to lift it, to reorganize it in the mind into a single unified image seen from overhead. Scholars describe the Bedolina petroglyph as an early aerial view, a picture of the world as no human of that era could have physically seen it. No one flew over Val Camonica in the Bronze Age. No one climbed high enough to take in the entire arrangement of fields at once. And yet someone rendered exactly that, a bird's-eye reconstruction of a working agricultural valley, carved into stone with the patience of a person who understood precisely what they were depicting. How did they build the image in their heads? The answer is lost. There is no record of the method, no surviving tradition, no explanation of how a pre-literate community developed the abstract spatial reasoning to translate three-dimensional lived experience into a two-dimensional overhead diagram. We know they did it. We can see the result on the rock. We know almost nothing else. What makes the Bedolina carving particularly haunting is what it suggests about the reach of human intelligence in prehistory. This was not a civilization with libraries and academies. These were farmers and herders in a mountain valley, working the land, dividing it, marking it. And one of them, or several, possessed a mind capable of a cartographic leap that would not become commonplace for thousands of years. How many similar minds existed across the tens of thousands of years of human prehistory that left no stone behind? The petroglyph is still there, still exposed on its gray slab in the alpine air, the pecked points slowly softening under rain and frost, the fields and paths of a vanished agricultural world preserved in rock. The farmers who carved it are gone. The valley they mapped has been reshaped by 100 generations since, but the map remains, an aerial view drawn by someone who could never have seen from the air, waiting for anyone willing to look up at the mountain and wonder how they knew. Number 5. Ptolemy's coordinates. In the 2nd century of the Common Era, a Greek scholar working in the great library city of Alexandria attempted something no one before him had dared. Claudius Ptolemy sat down to map the entire known world, not with pictures, not with coastlines sketched from a sailor's memory, but with numbers. His work, the Geographia, assigned latitude and longitude to thousands of locations across 3 continents: cities, rivers, mountain ranges, promontories. Each one pinned to the surface of the Earth by a pair of coordinates that could be written down, copied, and reconstructed by anyone who understood the system. Consider what that means. Ptolemy was not drawing a map. He was building a database. Every coastline in the ancient world had been recorded before, in one form or another. Sailors passed down the shapes of harbors. Traders memorized the distances between ports. But those records were fragile, tied to individual memory and individual hands. Ptolemy did something categorically different. He converted the world into a grid, a mathematical framework that survived the loss of the original drawings themselves. When his maps rotted or burned, the coordinates remained. From those numbers, a scholar centuries later could redraw the world from scratch. And that is exactly what happened. For over 1,000 years, Ptolemy's coordinate system guided the expansion of European civilization. When his manuscripts resurfaced in the medieval world, translated and copied and pored over by navigators, they became the foundation of Renaissance cartography. The men who set out across the Atlantic carried Ptolemy's framework in their instruments and their assumptions. His errors led them astray. His accuracy carried them forward. For a millennium, a dead Greek's numbers shaped where ships sailed and where empires reached. But here's where the story becomes genuinely unsettling, because those coordinates did not just guide explorers toward continents. They point, with startling precision, toward the buried past. Researchers studying the Geographia have used Ptolemy's ancient coordinates to identify real settlements that had vanished from every other record. Places named in his lists, cities that had crumbled to nothing and been forgotten for 2,000 years, plotted on his grid at a specific latitude and a specific longitude. Modern teams have taken those numbers, corrected for the systematic distortions in his system, and gone looking. And sometimes, in the exact place Ptolemy said a city should be, the ground gives up its dead. Foundations, pottery, the buried outlines of streets that no living person had ever seen. Think about the chain of survival required for this to happen. A settlement exists in the ancient world. Ptolemy records its position. The city dies, the people scatter, the stones sink into the soil, and every human being who ever knew the place is gone. Centuries pass. Empires rise and fall on top of the buried ruin, without ever suspecting it is there. And then a modern excavator, holding a set of numbers copied and recopied across 2,000 years, walks to a patch of empty ground and starts to dig. The settlement was lost. The coordinates were not. What makes this particularly disturbing is how it inverts our sense of who holds the knowledge. We imagine ourselves standing at the summit of understanding, looking back at primitive ancestors who saw the world dimly. But Ptolemy encoded the location of cities so precisely that his information outlived the cities themselves. He built a map that could find what no one remembered. The people who walked those streets are gone. Their names are gone. Their language, their gods, their reasons for being. All of it dissolved. And yet a number survived, and the number was enough. How many other coordinates in his lists still wait? How many settlements sit undisturbed beneath fields and roads and modern towns, marked on a 2,000-year-old grid that no one has thought to check? Ptolemy plotted thousands of locations. We have only begun to test them. His grid still works. That is the quiet horror of it. A framework built before the fall of Rome remains accurate enough to guide a shovel to a forgotten grave. And the Earth, when asked in the right coordinates, still answers. Number 4. The Madaba mosaic map. In the late 19th century, workers restoring a Byzantine church in the town of Madaba, in modern-day Jordan, uncovered something buried beneath the floor of a newer building. It was not a document. It was not painted on parchment or carved into a tablet. It was the floor itself. Spread across the ground was a mosaic, assembled from over 2 million individual colored tiles, and it depicted the Holy Land in a level of detail no one expected from the 6th century CE. This was cartography, rendered not in ink but in stone. Each tile, no larger than a fingernail, had been placed by hand to build a sprawling geographic portrait. Vivid greens marked the fertile valleys. Tans and browns traced the arid hills. Blues rendered the Dead Sea, and the artisans went further than mere outline. They set fish swimming in its waters. They placed boats upon its surface. Someone, 15 centuries ago, cared enough about accuracy to populate the sea with life. But the true achievement of the Madaba map was Jerusalem. Most ancient maps treated cities as symbols, a walled circle, a cluster of towers, a name. The Madaba mosaicists rendered Jerusalem at street level. The city appears in oval form, seen as if from above, with its gates, its walls, its churches, and running through its heart, a colonnaded main thoroughfare, lined with columns, depicted in careful rows. This was not a symbol of a city, it was a map of one. But here's where the mosaic stops being a beautiful artifact and becomes something more unsettling. For centuries, that central colonnaded street was assumed to be artistic license, a decorative flourish, the kind of idealized grandeur that ancient artists added to make a holy city look holy. No one could confirm it. Jerusalem had been destroyed, rebuilt, buried, and rebuilt again across 2,000 years. The street the mosaic showed lay somewhere beneath layers of accumulated history, if it had ever existed at all. Then the excavators went looking. Archaeologists digging through the strata of the old city eventually reached the remains of the Cardo Maximus, the great Roman Byzantine thoroughfare that had once run through Jerusalem's center. They found the column bases. They found the width of the road. They found the alignment. And when they compared what they had unearthed to the tiny tiles set into a church floor in another country, the match was exact. The colonnaded street the mosaicists had rendered in glass and stone was not decoration. It was a record. The Cardo ran precisely where the map had placed it. Consider what that means. A group of craftsmen, working in the 6th century, with nothing but tesserae and a knowledge of the land they lived in, encoded the layout of a city so faithfully that a spade in the 20th century could use their work as a guide. They were not guessing, they were not idealizing, they were reporting. The truly disturbing aspect is the medium itself. This was not a working map, folded and carried and consulted by travelers. It was a floor. It was meant to be walked upon, prayed above, worn smooth by centuries of feet. And yet the people who made it embedded within it a geographic precision that outlived their empire, their language, and their faith's dominion over that land. The map was decoration and testimony at once, and the testimony held. The mosaic remains in Madaba still, set into the floor of a modern church, missing sections, cracked in places, its tiles dulled by 1,500 years. Visitors walk beside it and see color and beauty. Few understand that beneath their feet lies a document that guided real shovels to real Roman stone, that turned an artist's floor into an excavation map centuries after the last mosaicist set the last tile and walked away. But the Madaba mosaicists were not the only ancient hands to draw roads that modern surveyors would later confirm ran exactly where they said. Number 3. Roads to India. In a library in Vienna sits a scroll that was copied by a monk in the 13th century, from an original that no longer exists. The copy is old. The thing it was copied from was ancient. Known today as the Tabula Peutingeriana, it is a medieval reproduction of a Roman itinerary map, and it depicts something almost impossible to imagine drawn by hand before the fall of the empire that built it. It shows the entire Roman road network, stretching from the coast of Britain in the west all the way to India in the east. The scale of the object itself defies expectation. Unrolled, the Tabula Peutingeriana stretches about 6.7 meters long. It is a scroll, not a page. And to fit the known world onto a strip that long and that narrow, the mapmaker did something that would horrify any modern cartographer. He crushed it. The map is heavily distorted, deliberately compressed vertically and stretched horizontally to fit the format. North-south distances collapse. East-west distances sprawl. The Mediterranean becomes a thin ribbon. Entire seas are reduced to slivers of empty space between the roads that mattered. Because the roads were the point. This was never meant to be a picture of geography. It was meant to be a tool for movement, a schematic for getting from one place to another across an empire that spanned 3 continents. It uses colored symbols to mark cities, spas, and waypoints along the routes, small pictograms that tell a traveler where to stop, where to rest, where to find water. It functions less like a map and more like a subway diagram of the ancient world, where the shape of the land is sacrificed entirely to the logic of the journey. And here is where a distorted, warped, physically impossible map becomes something more than a curiosity. The routes it records are real. For centuries, the tabula peutingeriana was treated as a beautiful abstraction, an artifact valued for its age and its strangeness rather than its accuracy. How could anything drawn with such violent distortion tell you where the ground actually was? But archaeological road surveys have repeatedly confirmed the route locations it recorded. Excavators tracing the paving stones of Roman roads across Europe, the Balkans, and the Near East have found them running exactly along the paths the scroll describes. The waypoints are where it says they are. The distances between stations, when the compression is accounted for, hold up against the physical remains buried in the soil. The truly unsettling aspect is what this means about the source. The 13th century monk copied something. That something was itself a copy of a road register that reached back into the working infrastructure of the Roman state, a document produced not by explorers guessing at the shape of the world, but by administrators who had walked every mile of it. The distortion was never ignorance, it was compression. The mapmaker knew precisely where everything was, and simply chose to fold the world to make it portable. Consider what survives here, an empire that has been gone for over a millennium, left behind a schematic of its own arteries, and when we dig, the arteries are still there, exactly where the schematic swore they would be. Cities that are now ruins, spa towns that are now fields, waypoints that are now nothing but a scatter of stone beneath a farmer's plow, all of them plotted on a scroll copied by a man who never saw the roads he was drawing. The tabula peutingeriana still rests in Vienna, its faded reds and browns tracing a network of stone that once carried legions from the edge of the Atlantic to the borders of Asia. The empire dissolved, the roads did not. And the scroll that mapped them keeps being proven right by the very ground it flattened. Number 2. The map that matched the rock. Around 1150 BCE, an unnamed scribe in ancient Egypt sat down with reed brushes and colored inks and drew a picture of the ground itself. Not a coastline, not a city plan, the rock beneath the sand. The document that resulted is known today as the Turin Papyrus map, and it is considered the oldest surviving geological and topographic map in human history. The map charts the Wadi Hammamat, a dry desert valley cutting through the eastern desert between the Nile and the Red Sea. This was mining country. The Egyptians extracted gold there, and they quarried a prized dark stone called bekan for statues and sarcophagi. The papyrus records all of it: gold mines, quarries, the winding path of the wadi, settlements where the workers lived. A landscape of extraction, mapped by people who needed to find their way back to wealth buried in stone. But here is what elevates the Turin Papyrus above every other ancient map. The scribe did not simply draw the terrain. He color-coded the geology. Different rock formations were painted in different inks. Pink for one type of stone, brown for another, black for a third. Each hue was a deliberate signal, a code for the material composition of the ground, so that anyone reading the map could distinguish one geological zone from the next at a glance. 3,500 years ago, someone understood that the Earth was not uniform, that it was assembled from distinct materials, and that those distinctions could be recorded on a flat sheet of papyrus. The numbers behind this are almost impossible to absorb. This map predates the Roman road network by more than 1,000 years. It predates Ptolemy's coordinate system by over 13 centuries. It predates the entire concept of scientific geology as a discipline by roughly 3,000 years. The people who invented modern geology in the 18th and 19th centuries believed they were charting new intellectual territory. An anonymous Egyptian had been there in the reign of Ramesses IV. But here is where the story becomes genuinely remarkable. For most of its modern life, the Turin Papyrus was treated as a curiosity, an ancient sketch of academic interest but questionable accuracy. Then geologists went to the Wadi Hammamat with modern survey tools and compared the ground to the map. And the map held. The rock-type distinctions that the ancient scribe had painted in pink and brown and black were confirmed as broadly accurate. The zones he colored differently correspond to genuinely different geological formations. The stone he mapped as one material is, in fact, one material. The boundaries he drew between rock types track real transitions in the underlying geology. A document made 32 centuries ago, using inks and reed brushes, describes the composition of a desert valley with a fidelity that modern instruments have verified. What makes this particularly unsettling is what it implies about the people who made it. This was not a lucky guess. This was not decorative art that happened to align with reality. To color code geology accurately, The scribe had to observe the ground carefully, understand that visible surface differences signal deeper material differences, and possess a system for recording those differences on a portable medium. That is field geology. That is empirical observation translated into a repeatable notation. And it was happening in the Bronze Age, in a civilization we tend to remember for its tombs and its gods, not its earth science. The fragile sheet survives now in a museum in Turin, its pink and brown and black inks faded but still legible, still marking the boundaries between one kind of stone and another. The scribe who drew it is gone. His name is gone. But the rock he mapped is still there in the Egyptian desert, still divided along the lines he traced, waiting exactly where he said it would be. Not every map that turned out to be right was drawn from careful observation. Some were compiled from sources that no longer exist. Number 1. The Piri Reis enigma. In 1513, an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis assembled a map on a sheet of gazelle skin parchment, and in the corner notes written in his own hand, he confessed something that scholars have never been able to explain. He had not surveyed these coastlines himself. He had compiled the map from older source charts, dozens of them. Some he claimed dated back to the age of Alexander the Great. He was not the cartographer. He was the copyist, and the originals he copied from are gone. Only a fragment of his work survives. Roughly 90 by 63 centimeters, faded now to muted reds and browns, crossed by hand-drawn compass roses that radiate across the parchment like the spokes of some forgotten navigational instrument. What remains shows the western coast of Africa, the eastern edge of South America, and a lower landmass that has generated more argument than perhaps any other feature on any map ever drawn. The coastline of South America is rendered with a fidelity that should have been impossible in 1513, only 2 decades after Columbus, when European knowledge of that continent was fragmentary at best. But here's where the map descends from historical curiosity into something genuinely unsettling. Below South America, the surviving fragment shows an additional stretch of coastline that some researchers have identified as Antarctica. Not the Antarctica of pack ice and glacial shelf, the bare bedrock coastline beneath the ice. The fringe theories are seductive precisely because they are so clean. If the map shows an ice-free Antarctic coast, then Piri Reis was copying from source charts made before the ice existed, which would push the origin of that knowledge back thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of years, to a time when no civilization capable of oceanic cartography is supposed to have existed. An entire lost cartographic tradition, mapping the poles before the last great freeze, its knowledge surviving as faint copies of copies, until an Ottoman admiral stitched the fragments together on gazelle skin. Mainstream scholars dispute this, and their objections are serious. The southern landmass may simply be a distorted, misplaced rendering of South America's own coast, bent to fit the edge of the parchment. The apparent accuracy may be coincidence dressed up as prophecy. The map does not require a vanished Ice Age civilization to explain it. It requires only the ordinary distortions of Renaissance cartography and the human hunger to find patterns in faded ink. Both readings are defensible. Both leave the central mystery untouched. Because the argument over Antarctica obscures the fact that Piri Reis told us plainly what he had done. He did not invent this map. He assembled it from older charts, and those older charts are lost. Every one of them. We possess the copy and not a single original. We are staring at the shadow of a body of knowledge that no longer exists, and we cannot see the thing that cast the shadow. That is the true weight of the Piri Reis map. Not whether it shows an ice-free pole, whether the source charts, whatever they contained and however old they truly were, represented a depth of geographic understanding that has simply vanished from the historical record. Piri Reis was working from a library. That library is gone. Where those charts went, who made them, how far back their lineage actually reached, none of it survives. Only the admiral's note, insisting that he was the last man to hold them in his hands. The fragment sits today in the Topkapı Palace in Istanbul, sealed away from light, its reds and browns fading a little further with each passing decade. It is not a map of the world. It is a map of what someone, somewhere, at some unrecoverable point in the past, already knew and wrote down and then lost. The compass roses still point outward toward coastlines drawn by hands we will never identify, and the parchment keeps its silence, the way parchment does, holding the outline of a knowledge that arrived from somewhere, was copied once, and then disappeared. step back from any single map, and a pattern emerges, and it is not comforting. Across 10 artifacts separated by thousands of years and thousands of kilometers, the same impossible thing keeps happening. Coastlines drawn before anyone had sailed them. Geology charted before anyone had the tools to measure it. Rivers and quarries and mountain ranges recorded with an accuracy that modern survey would only confirm centuries later. The pattern is consistent. Ancient cartographers set down the shape of the world in ink and stone and clay, and then the world waited. It waited for ships that had not yet been built. It waited for instruments that had not yet been imagined. And when those ships finally sailed and those instruments finally measured, the ground matched the parchment. Not approximately, not by coincidence. In case after case, the ancient line and the modern reading fell into the same place. Some of these maps predate the exploration that would confirm them by centuries. That is the detail that refuses to sit quietly. A map cannot describe a coastline no one has seen, and yet the record shows, again and again, exactly that. Which returns us to the question the Piri Reis map left hanging. The source charts it was compiled from are lost, not misplaced, not awaiting rediscovery in some archive, gone. Whoever drew the originals, whatever knowledge they carried, whatever voyages or measurements or inherited traditions, stood behind those vanished sheets, none of it survives. The admiral copied from something. That something no longer exists. And this is the truly unsettling aspect of all 10. The knowledge behind the oldest maps cannot be fully recovered. We hold the copies. We hold the fragments. We can confirm that the makers knew things they should not have known. But the how is gone, dissolved into the same silence that swallowed the source charts. We inherited the answers without the reasoning, the map without the mapmaker, the line without the hand that drew it. Somewhere in the deep past, people looked at the world and understood its shape well enough to encode it in stone and skin, and then they vanished, taking their methods with them. What remains sits in museums and archives, still accurate, still waiting, still refusing to explain itself. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now